The torture killer, Christopher Moore Jr., has been jailed for life over the murder of Brian Waters. The 43-year-old from Lim was yesterday found guilty of murdering the dad of two in front of his own children during a brutal 4-hour ordeal at Burns House Farm in Tabley back in 2003. He returned to Chester Crown Court for sentence today and received a life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. The sentencing judge, Justice Peter Openshaw, said Brian Waters was a loyal and devoted husband and father, and his family will remember him as such. Because of drug deals that went wrong, Waters became indebted to John Wilson, a more ruthless criminal. He could not pay the £20,000 which he demanded of him, and Wilson was determined to make an example of him. Wilson discovered that Waters was likely to be at the farm on June the 19th and planned and directed an attack on him. He put together a team consisting of James Raven, Otis Matthews, the defendant, and others who have not yet been brought to justice. In my judgment, the attacks on both men were more than an attempted extortion with menace. The sustained barbarity and sadism of the attack was intended to deliver a clear message, not just to Brian Waters, but also to others, that if you cross John Wilson and fail to pay what he considered was due, there would be very, very serious consequences. The judge described how Mr. Waters pleaded with his attackers to have his restraints eased as he could not breathe, but added it was too late to save him and he died in front of his own children. I have no doubt that going on the run for 16 years with warrants for his arrest in force is a seriously aggravating factor. For during all that time, the family of Brian Waters and indeed Suleiman Razak were denied justice. The memory of their ordeal and witnessing their father's murder is a burden which they must bear every day. It will cast a shadow over the rest of their lives. So Christopher Moore Jr. actually changed his name to Andrew Christopher Lamb, and we'll get into that now. So he portrayed himself as a successful businessman with extraordinary contacts such as the Moroccan royal family and the Egyptian military, and he lived in a grand villa in Malta. He drove a Porsche and was a luxury yacht captain. But as we know, he was not who he claimed to be. Andrew Lamb was in fact Christopher Moore Jr., a killer involved in the torture and murder of Brian Waters, as we've just discussed, in front of his own children in the most brutal fashion. So in 2019, a full 16 years on from those horrific events of June 2003, Moore's life of opulence came crashing down after Cheshire police finally caught up with him. And the way it all unfolded, it's like a Hollywood movie. He actually grew up in privilege and wealth, and although he wasn't a natural academic, he excelled as a junior sportsman. He was a talented swimmer, and he represented Cheshire at lacrosse as a youth. Their family home in Lim was more of a gated estate, complete with a swimming pool where members of the Moore clan resided in their own separate houses. Upon leaving school, the teenager joined the family business. But this was no run-of-the-mill construction firm or retail operation, because Christopher Moore Sr. was involved in the world of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Like his dad, the son soon proved to have the skills to make it a success in the industry himself. By his mid-20s, he had infiltrated an organised crime gang on a notorious estate in Wolverhampton and a far-right movement in Nottingham during projects working with the likes of Channel 4 and the BBC. If you were to believe his own accounts, this was the extent of his interests in criminality, but in reality he had become involved in the underworld himself, and in a big, big way. In the early 2000s, John Wilson was one of North West's most notorious gangsters. Brian Waters had contacts in the Netherlands and would broker drug deals between Wilson and his Dutch associates. While travelling back to the UK from Holland on one occasion in 1999, Mr. Waters was stopped at the port and found to be in possession of £20,000 in cash, which was money belonging to Wilson. The pair continued heavy involvements with one another though, and Mr. Waters was dealing cocaine on his behalf in late 2002. Around Christmas time, he was robbed of several thousands of pounds worth of drugs at gunpoint in Manchester, and therefore left further indebted. This was when Moore came in the scene. An increasingly angered Wilson told the man whom it was not wise to cross, instructed him to put his famed talents for surveillance to use on the Waters family. Upon tailing Mr. Waters' son Gavin from their Nantwich home to Burnt House Farm in Tabley, he discovered the cannabis farm they had set up in secret. Wilson, who regularly supplied Moore with cocaine free of charge, gave the orders for his gang to ransack the grow, stealing both the drugs and the cultivating equipment from the factory. June the 19th, 2003 was the strike date, the day after Mr. Waters' daughter's 21st birthday, and only 3 days after he and his wife had returned from the Netherlands. Moore's involvement was to continue past the reconnaissance stage. Otis Matthews, who was Wilson's right-hand man, and Ashley Gishard stayed over at Burnfoot Lane Farm the night before due to its handy location around 10 minutes drive from Burnhouse Farm. At roughly 4 a.m. in the morning on the Thursday morning, the trio set off to the rural site, which is now used as a commercial car workshop, situated only a stone's throw from junction 19 off the M6 in Knutsford, and in convoy with Moore's distant cousin, James Raven. Over the following few hours, they set about dismantling the cannabis farm, with Moore claiming to have kept watch whilst the others went about their work. Factually, the operation didn't end there. At around midday, Suleiman Razak, the stepson of Mujahid Johnny Majid, who Mr. Waters met during a spell in prison in the early 80s and with whom he had set up the cannabis farm, arrived at Burnhouse Farm to tend to the grow, which on average yielded about £1,000 worth of drugs a week. He was immediately ambushed by around half a dozen of Wilson's men, who punched and kicked him in the face and demanded money. Mr. Razak was suspended upside down and lowered headfirst into a barrel which was filled with water, electrocuted and burnt with acidic plant food. A pillowcase was placed over his head and set on fire, and he was attacked with an industrial staple gun before Mr. Waters arrived at the scene. After being whipped with canes with such ferocity that they snapped, he too was hung upside down by his ankles and beaten using a metal bar. He was tied to a chair and a bin bag was set alight above his head, causing the metal plastic to drip down onto him. While Gavin and Natalie Waters appeared at the farm, Mr. Waters pleaded with the attackers, who were armed with machetes and a black handgun, which later transpired to be an imitation firearm, not to hurt his children. But they were also attacked and tied up with his daughter, having had the barrel of the gun placed in her mouth. At the same time, 2 men were raiding the Waters family home in search for money and valuables. One theory which was advanced by the prosecution is that Moore was one of this pair due to his knowledge of the route between the house in Nantwich and the cannabis farm, Matthews being the other. The mum from the address and drove her to Burnhouse Farm, arriving at the same time as the police, who had earlier been called under Wilson's orders. So what they say in here is Wilson organised the hit and he called the cops, and actually Christopher Guestmore Jr. was trying to sell a story to the media that Wilson was a police informant. Anyway, Mr. Waters' lifeless body was found in the milking parlour, his assailants having scarpered. A post-mortem investigation found that the 44-year-old had suffered more than 100 separate injuries, including multiple broken ribs, a fractured nose, bleeding on the brain and bruising to the heart during the roughly 3-hour ordeal. It was a truly stark reminder that the violence goes hand in hand with the supply of drugs. Detective Inspector Kate Tomlinson, the senior investigating officer in the case, said, "You really don't come across jobs like this every day. The brutality of it is so severe that it really opens your eyes. We're used to dealing with violent crime, but this takes your breath away. It's the stuff that television programs are made out of." Brian Waters was in the drugs world and he was associating with well-known criminals who were very, very well connected. When you run with those sorts of people, it's a dangerous world to be living in and you run those risks, and unfortunately, he paid the highest price for living in that world. But is £20,000 really worth what went on that day? It just does not feel right, and it goes to show how dangerous it is associating with these sorts of people. It's possibly not just about the money, it's about them being disrespected as well. I can't imagine that £20,000 is worth killing somebody for. Moore was able to avoid arrest at the scene, but crucially the gang inadvertently left behind a treasure trove of DNA evidence. During the lengthy period they spent at the farm, they took special care to leave all their waste, whether it be wrappings of the food or drink they had consumed or the ends of cigarettes that they had smoked, in a plastic bag which they planned to take with them after leaving, but they forgot to take it. And there was even, as I said in my previous video yesterday, there was even human waste, i.e. shit. But the killers fled in a hurry upon police showing up unexpectedly, and then in their panic they accidentally left that bag behind. The contents were examined and the feces were found to contain Moore's DNA. He had also torn a strip of abandoned pram cover, the remainder of which Mr. Razak's blood was found on it, and used it as toilet paper. Samples taken from a bottle of Sprite and Marlboro Light ends were a match, as was a glove found near to the main gate of the farm. A horse box containing the stolen £50,000 worth of cannabis and equipment was later discovered in the car park of the Barn Owl pub in Lim, yards away from Moore's home. Perhaps the knowledge of this hugely incriminating stack of evidence, he fled the country, flying to Malaga from Liverpool John Lennon Airport in June 2003, and he was not seen on the shores of the UK for the best part of 2 decades. Days later, his father visited him in Spain, leaving a suitcase full of clothes with him and returning in possession of his mobile phone. The following month, his mum also flew out to see her son one final time before he began his new life in hiding. Between 2003 and 2007, Christopher Guestmore Jr.'s movements are unconfirmed. However, while giving evidence during his eventual murder trial, he claimed he had travelled to South Africa and Mozambique using a passport with his new identity of Andrew Lamb and worked driving boats. Short spell in Turkey followed, but he ultimately settled in Malta 4 years on from Mr. Waters' death. Here, Moore, or as he was known as Lamb, was able to build his reputation as a successful businessman who invested in a variety of high-value deals. The delivery of cargo to Taiwan on behalf of BP, he was negotiating with the Iranians, he was building businesses with the Moroccan royal family and the Egyptian military, and he was also investing nearly £500,000 in Libyan companies. He lived an extravagant, affluent, luxurious and cash-rich lifestyle, and he went on to find a partner on the Mediterranean island. He worked as a captain out of the exclusive Port Masso Marina, lived in a large house with a swimming pool, and drove a Porsche Cayenne. So years had passed, and he was watching from afar as his co-conspirators were convicted and jailed. Wilson and Raven were found guilty of murder in 2004 in one of the first UK trials to use cell sighting evidence, data showing the approximate locations of phones via masts. Each received a minimum of 24 years behind bars before Matthews was caged for at least 22 years, although Gishard was acquitted. Moore's dad, as I said yesterday, was even sent to prison for 9 months for assisting his son's escape. Moore was elevated and his status became to one of Europe's most wanted criminals in May 2019. Detectives were able to gain vital intelligence as a result, although the exact nature of this has not been disclosed. Moore was arrested only 4 weeks after being placed onto the most wanted list in a new build apartment in Malta, but continued to maintain that he was Andrew Lamb during frustrating extradition proceedings which lasted nearly a year. It was only after his tips were taken that he was forced to concede his true identity, but he continued to contest his removal back to his home country, claiming to be scared of coming across Wilson and his associates within the UK prison system, including Matthews, who was reportedly being held up north. The reason for his apparent fear was also a cornerstone of his defence in the courtroom. Moore alleged that his involvement with the gang was his continued role as an undercover television researcher. Believing that Wilson was also a police informant, he befriended him in the hope of selling his story to the media. This would have been a risky strategy indeed. He stated on the witness box that the crime boss discovered his supposed scheme on the day of the murder via Raven and ordered him to leave before Mr. Razak's arrival, conveniently limiting his involvement vastly. Brian Waters' family said in a statement, "We would like to thank detectives from Cheshire Constabulary, the prosecution team and everyone else involved in the case for all of their hard work and tireless and extensive investigations, which now span more than 18 years. We would also like to extend our thanks to the family liaison officers for their help, advice and support over the years. What happened at Burnt House Farm on the 19th of June 2003 has had a significant and long-lasting effect on our family. We will never be able to forget the events of that day, and even now, more than 18 years down the line, we feel the pain on a daily basis with constant flashbacks. We have remained a close-knit family and have provided much-needed support to each other, but this has been an isolating experience for us, and not only have we lived in fear of reprisals, we have also struggled to trust others as we normally would. But we never gave up hope, and the verdict today marks the end of an incredibly painful journey in our lives." So guys, that's a story with regards to Christopher Guestmore, who's been jailed for life over the murder of Brian Waters. Let me know what you think. It's your boy GC. Keep it locked, keep it real.